Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, everybody. This is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. This week, I speak a lot about foreign affairs, something which I generally do not do. But with the situation in the world today and our Prime Minister, Bennett, visiting the American president, I wanted to make a few comments. I sent a letter to the Jerusalem Post newspaper, which they published on Wednesday morning, and I want to share what I wrote with you. I wrote the following. The large mass of words produced by experts, observers, and pundits since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan obscures the two cardinal issues for Israel raised by this event. First, directly east of Israel, there are now two launching pads for transnational violence, particularly against Israel. There is Iran, which is nearing nuclear capability, and Afghanistan, which is now a secure base and well-armed breeding ground for Islamic terrorism. Second, the confusion and lack of preparation exhibited by the Biden administrations mean that it will probably be unable and or unwilling to come to Israel's assistance in the event of a threat to our very existence. Our approach to this problem will be presented to Biden in a visit of Naftali Bennett to Washington. This approach should reflect a short and pithy comment made by U.S. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia in the 1960s at the height of the struggle for civil rights for blacks. When asked why he, a longtime and hardline segregationist, will no longer participate in the filibuster to prevent passage of civil rights legislation, Russell, a realist who understood the political environment, bluntly and picturesquely said, "When the water gets to the second deck, it is every rat for himself." Unquote. Israel has to do what our history and our future demand that it do. These are difficult times, and with the help of God, we will get through. I'll be back after the break.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I think by now my listeners know that I do not like to talk about foreign affairs for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm no expert. And second of all, things change rapidly here in the Middle East. Professor Ahrens, who was Israel's foreign minister for a while, he had been the head of Israel Aircraft Industries, and I knew him personally. And he was fond of saying that the Middle East is not the Middle West, which is quite true. And often the listeners don't quite understand the things that happen in the Middle East, and they require a significant amount of explanation. And of course, my program is on only once a week, and as a result, it's very different to keep up and talk about things that might change between program to the next program. But I do want to talk about the American action here in the Middle East, particularly in the light of what's happening now in Afghanistan. I want to start by reading a letter which I wrote to the Jerusalem Post on Monday. I don't know if they're going to print it, but I want to read it to the listeners because I think it has something to say. I wrote the following. The large mass of words produced by experts and observers and pundits since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan obscures the two cardinal issues for Israel raised by this event. First of all, directly east of Israel, there are now two launching pads for transnational violence, particularly against Israel. These are Iran, which is nearing nuclear capability, and Afghanistan, which is now a secure base and a breeding ground for Islamic terrorism. Second of all, the confusion and lack of preparation exhibited by the Biden administrations means that it will be unable and or unwilling to come to Israel's assistance in the event of a threat to our very existence. Our approach to this problem will be presented to Biden in the upcoming visit of our Prime Minister Naftali Bennett to Washington. It's supposed to be next week. This approach should reflect a short and pithy comment made by U.S. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia back in the 1960s at the height of the struggle for civil rights for blacks. When asked why he, Senator Russell, a longtime and hardline segregationist, will no longer participate in the filibuster to prevent passage of civil rights legislation, Russell, who is a realist who understands the political environment, bluntly and picturesquely said, "When the water gets to the second deck, it is every rat for himself," unquote. And Israel has to do what our history and our future demand that Israel do, regardless of what any other nation, particularly the United States, thinks about our actions. We have an existential threat, and now two countries directly to the east of us, one under a Shiite government, the other under a Sunni government. The Shiites and the Sunnis are not too crazy about each other, but they both agree that they would like to see the state of Israel destroyed. That is the problem we are facing now. And the truth of the matter is, I really wish that President Biden were interested in learning from history. However, the pattern is becoming more pronounced every day. Instead of learning from the mistakes of previous administrations, especially the Obama administration, Biden is following in the previous ill-fated footsteps. When Obama took office 7 years after 9/11, he wanted to forget the lessons, and he fundamentally changed America's perspective on the challenges and threats to the Middle East, especially in the Middle East and North Africa regime. President Obama embraced many groups and individuals that the U.S. had previously shunned because of their links to radical jihadist movements and radical jihadist theology. This includes buttering up to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Many nations in our region consider the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization. At the very least, the Muslim Brotherhood has a history of engaging in terrorism. It is decidedly anti-Western, anti-American, and certainly anti-Israel. Many members of the Muslim Brotherhood are known terrorist leaders, and radical Islamist ideology is widespread in the Muslim Brotherhood. When Obama was less than 2 years in office, the Arab Spring rocked the Middle East, and as part of his historical utopianism, the Obama administration tolerated the overthrow of the Egyptian president. He was far from an ideal ruler, but he was an ally of the United States and a powerful force against radical Islamism and against jihadist terrorism. In a region full of sworn enemies of Israel and sworn enemies of the United States, Mubarak, president of Egypt at that time, maintained full diplomatic relations with Israel. When Mubarak fell, Egypt came under the control of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it didn't turn out well. This repeated itself in Libya, when Obama allied with the radical groups that wanted to overthrow Gaddafi. And Gaddafi was indeed overthrown, but the situation has not returned to any kind of normalcy. In 2012, the U.S. ambassador Chris Stevens and two other Americans were killed in Benghazi by a Libyan terrorist group, and secret shipment of arms were sent from Libya to the rebels in Syria. And some of the groups received arms from Libya with the support of the Obama administration. And all of this became the core of what the world could come to know as ISIS. Libya lacks a functioning government to this very day. And Obama's record in Iran, which apparently Biden wants to imitate, is the worst of all. In pursuit of a flawed nuclear deal, Obama lifted sanctions on the radical regime of the mullahs, the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And Lebanon has sunk into a failed state. Hezbollah continues to threaten Israel. A devastating war drags on in Yemen, and a revitalized, violently anti-American and anti-Israelite Iran is the dominant power in Iraq. And Obama had a nuclear deal, which was no good, and now Biden wants to revive it. Trump pulled out of it. So we see it most clearly today in Afghanistan. In fact, Biden is effectively siding with the jihadists. The results are the same: disaster. We may never know if Biden made some sort of deal with the Taliban. Biden probably thought he could limit the damage, but he's double-crossed by his negotiating partners. The people of Afghanistan, as we are seeing, will suffer significantly. The U.S. and Israel will be at greater risk, much greater risk, from a reinvigorated radical jihadist movement in Afghanistan, not only the Taliban, but also Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who may now well have a new home in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. I don't know if Biden cares about history, but he certainly doesn't understand it. He's reading from the failed playbook of his predecessor, Obama. And I heard British commentators on Monday saying that Biden is so bad as commander-in-chief who should not be impeached, he should be court-martialed. And this was what we have to live with. Taiwan, Ukraine, Israel, and American allies such as Japan and Australia are in danger. They are the partners most at risk because of Biden's failure in Afghanistan and his inadequate responses to China and Russia. The United States is at a much greater risk than just a few weeks ago. It was once felt that attacks against the U.S. will be met with harsh response. I no longer know whether this is true. Now, Biden has a skewed worldview particularly of the Middle East, and we are suffering from it. That is the reality on the ground today. I'll be back after the break.
Hi, I'm Steve Miller.
And I'm Matt Zucker.
Join us for Lighten Up, where we take a look at the week's current events in Israel and from around the Jewish world through a humorous lens.
If you've been paying attention during these crazy times, you know that it's a challenge to parody life anymore. But join Steve and I as we give it the old college try. Not only is being happy an obligation, but life is just too short to take it all so seriously.
So join me, Steve Miller.
And me, Matt Zucker.
For Lighten Up every Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Israel, only on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
We're back with Jay Shapiro. The first segment of the program was kind of heavy, so I want to do something a little lighter this time, but I think it should be of interest to the listeners. First, we have to start with some history. The Bar Kokhba revolt, which is also known as the Third Jewish Revolt, broke out in the year 132 over religious restrictions imposed by the Romans, as well as the Roman decision to build a Roman city over the ruins of Jewish Jerusalem, including a pagan sanctuary where the temple was destroyed some 60 years earlier on the same spot. The rebellion was led by Shimon Bar Kokhba. Now, why am I sharing this with the listeners? Because an ancient coin dating back to the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans will soon fly into space with an Israeli astronaut named Eitan Shtibi, and he's got this coin from our Antiquities Authority. Eitan Shtibi is set to reach the International Space Station in a mission led by the Ramon Foundation and the Israel Space Agency as part of a major mission, the first one entirely manned by private astronauts. It's called the AX-1 mission. And by the way, the Ramon Foundation is named after the first Israeli astronaut, Ilan Ramon, who after a number of successful circles, the spaceship in which he was came apart and burned up when it's returned into the atmosphere, and now the Ramon Foundation doing research is named after him. So what's going to happen is, as part of this mission to the International Space Station, our new astronaut, Shtiba, will be taking a bag filled with items that have a special meaning to Israelis. It was clear to him, in a statement he made, that one of these items will be a symbol of Jewish history. He saw the coin minted with palm tree and vine leaves that for him represent the connection to the land, the love of the country, and the desire of the population of Israel in those years, in the year 132, their desire for independence. The palm tree particularly touched the astronaut, as it is the symbol of the Agricultural Research Organization at the Volcanti Center in Israel, where his father spent his life conducting research on the soil of Israel. Now, back in those days, in the year 132, minting coins was an important expression of sovereignty. Interestingly enough, the Jewish rebels, used existing Roman coins and restruck them with their own themes and their own messages. Such an act was an outrageous affront to the Roman rulers. These coins had first and foremost a symbolic meaning as Jewish propaganda, as they could only be used for commerce among the Jewish rebels themselves. So this coin that Sheba will carry to outer space has the following inscription on it: Year 2 of the Liberty of Israel. It was recently found in a historic expedition surveying the caves of the Judean desert in order to locate more fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other archaeological remains and to save them from looters. These scrolls, by the way, are a corpus of 25,000 fragments that were unearthed in caves on the shores of the Dead Sea back in the 1940s and 1950s. And just getting these fragments is a mystery novel unto itself, because at that time, the Dead Sea was not part of Israel. It was under the Jordanian government. And the books have been written about how these things were found and how Bedouins were used to uncover them and so forth. It's a mystery story unto itself. But these fragments include some of the most ancient manuscripts of the Bible and other religious texts that were not accepted into the canon, and also some non-religious writings. So during his time at the International Space Station, the Israeli astronaut will run several experiments on behalf of Israeli universities, Israeli startups, and Israeli hospitals. Now, the goal of this mission is to expand the Israeli aerospace industry, but also to inspire a new generation of Israeli children. It will mark the first time they'll be able to listen to someone speaking Hebrew from outer space. So the very fact that the Israeli astronaut chose to take with him to space an ancient item bearing symbolic significance is really very exciting and very meaningful, because this is a historic meeting between the ancient world and the height of human innovation today. The Jewish rebels who struck this coin 1,800 years ago while fighting against the Romans for their lives and independence could not have imagined in their wildest dreams that after 1,800 years, this item will make its way to outer space with a Jewish astronaut who lives in an independent Jewish state. So I think that is absolutely fascinating. I wanted to share this with the listeners. I hope it's as meaningful to you as it is to me. This next item is of no immediate importance. Matter of fact, I don't think it's important at all. But I want to share it with the listeners because I think you know who Alan Dershowitz is, and you know who Larry David is. Larry David is a character on television who's very amusing. At any rate, it turns out that both Alan Dershowitz and Larry David have vacation homes on Martha's Vineyard. Now, according to an article in the New York Times a week ago, Larry David screamed at Alan Dershowitz at a popular convenience store on the island. And this apparently is because Dershowitz, who is known to be a Democrat, had ties to the Donald Trump campaign in recent years. So as a result of this, these ties to Trump have made Dershowitz a pariah at this vacation spot, according to the newspaper. But the incident with Larry David, which involved two of the world's most prominent Jews, one a legal expert and the other essentially an entertainment. This is circulating on the internet apparently primarily because of its humorous details. David apparently said the following to Dershowitz, among other things. He said to him, "It's disgusting, your whole enclave. It's disgusting. You're disgusting." The lawyer said something back to him before he drove off, and what the newspaper, the Times, reported as an old dirty Volvo. Now, Dershowitz didn't find the scene to be funny. After David critiqued him for being close with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former President Trump, Dershowitz told the newspaper that he worked with Pompeo, a former student of his at Harvard, on the Trump administration's Israel policy. So Dershowitz went on to say something amusing. He said, while Larry David was writing bad jokes, I was helping to bring about peace in the Middle East. By the way, Dershowitz defended Trump against impeachment calls during several interviews during his presidency, and he also was the defender of O.J. Simpson, and he also had ties to the late disgraced Jewish financier Jerry Epstein. Now, in response, many of the liberal Martha's Vineyard's people now shun Dershowitz. And he answered by saying, "I'm proud to take on unpopular principled positions that gets me shunned by partisan zealots. It's not about me. I couldn't care less about being shunned by such people." So there is Larry David versus Alan Dershowitz, and I share it with the listeners for what it's worth. I'm not sure how much it's worth, but I thought it's a light item on my program, which tends, I believe, particularly this week, to be kind of heavy. So I think a little amusement is in order. I'll be back after the break.
Are you tired of political correctness and the fear that you might offend someone?
I'm not afraid to offend you.
Wow, look who's talking tough.
One has to be tough to keep sane today.
Hi, I'm Alan Skorsky.
And I'm Beulah Seabrow.
And join us every Wednesday for The Definitive Wrap as we interview the most sought-after guests and expose progressive trends that masquerade as enlightenment but actually destroy our freedoms.
We are the No Woke Zone, so buckle up to this exciting show.
Buckling up, but I'm driving.
Sure, you can drive, but I'm the navigator.
Tune in for the No Nonsense, The Definitive Wrap Show, every Wednesday on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Because our Prime Minister is scheduled to be in Washington this week and speaking to the American President, I want to say a few more words about foreign affairs, which is a subject I generally do not discuss, but I think it's important this time around. Right now, the Biden administration is in almost total disgrace because of what's happening in Afghanistan. The representatives of the administration who appear on television absolutely seem to contradict their own words just about every day. So the American administration is in a state of deep confusion just at a time when our prime minister is scheduled to meet with the president. So I think it's important to mention that there are issues that touch on our sovereignty and our destiny as a nation that are going to impact the relationship with the United States. Now, one of these issues is dividing Jerusalem, and perhaps it is the paradigm for other issues. We have expended a tremendous amount of blood and treasure, time and time again, to maintain our nation in the midst of a continual hostile environment of our neighbors. It is true that some relationships have developed with Muslim countries recently, which is good, and a lot of it has to do with their fear of Iran, but that's a subject unto itself. Against all odds, we succeeded and uniting the city of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, and it is our eternal capital. And it is I myself live in Jerusalem, and it is a city of about 1 million people, of whom about a third are Arabs, and at least in the western part of the city, they mix quite freely. Now, our enemies know this, and they hate us for it. They hate our openness, they hate our success, they hate our very existence. Their own pretended interest in Jerusalem, which is only the third city in the Islam order of holy cities, their interest that they show in Jerusalem is solely a function of the fact that Israel now has Jerusalem in its sovereignty. They have succeeded in turning their genocidal quest into a human rights issue, and they have thus attracted soft-hearted and also soft-headed Americans into their cause. They particularly succeeded among left-wing progressive Democrats, the Democratic Party, who see the Palestinians as an oppressed people under the thumb of a conquering Israel. Because the governing Democratic Party in the United States is itself a balancing act between the progressives and the more moderates, the progressives have succeeded in achieving power beyond their size and influence beyond their size, and are intent on using that power to denigrate and change the relationship between the United States and Israel. There was a period under Trump when the United States visibly had Israel's back. The pressures for concessions and goodwill gestures and poorly conceived policies designed to benefit the Palestinians were all gone under the Trump administration, and now apparently they are all coming back. Now, there is only one major problem with this American approach to the Palestinian-Israel problem. The problem is that it's a zero-sum game. Any benefit to the Palestinians comes at the expense of Israel, for the simple reason that the Palestinians are not interested in living with Israel in peace, but rather they want to replace us. There are now reports that the U.S. will ask our new government, now that our Prime Minister is visiting in Washington, the U.S. will ask our new government to authorize the opening of a Palestinian Affairs consulate in the very heart of Jerusalem. This, by the way, would be the equivalent of during the Cold War of of Russia asking Eisenhower or Kennedy for the right to open a consulate in Georgetown. International law requires the acquiescence of the host country for such a consulate. Common sense and a basic sense of self-preservation and national interest would clearly point to the fact that our government refuse if the Americans request that a Palestinian consulate be opened in our capital city. Now, our new foreign minister, Yair Lapid, is enamored with the agenda and mindset of the progressive Democrats, and he seems intent in currying favor with them. While he characterizes an attempt to reinstill a bipartisan posture vis-a-vis the Americans, by all appearances, he is in sync and identifies and supports the progressive outlook in the Democratic Party. The feeling, I believe, of the Democrats toward Israel is not mutual. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has impressive right-wing credentials. He used to be at one time the Secretary General of the Samaria Council, Judea and Samaria Council, which is about as right-wing as you can get. Now, the question is, what will his position be now that he's worried about political self-preservation? Bennett wants U.S. approval, particularly from the Democrats, as a way of showing that he was able to accomplish an accommodation that, for example, Netanyahu did not have. Netanyahu was very closely associated with the Republicans, and the Democrats were aware of this. And now our new prime minister wants to show that he is bipartisan. He wants to show that he can unite American opinion in favor of Israel. But the question is, what is the price of that approval? It could be very high. For example, it would cause the creation of a Palestinian office in Jerusalem, and it would create the presumption that this is just a first but significant step to a more formal Palestinian presence in Jerusalem, which is our capital city. To open a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem would represent an unprecedented Israeli formal acquiescence in a two-state solution with Palestinian capital somewhere in a divided Jerusalem. Our prime minister must understand that he would be doing himself and Israel a terrible disservice by agreeing to a request for a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem. Our prime minister needs to understand he's being used by the Biden administration to show some kind of a victory and accomplishment after the terrible collapse in Afghanistan. Not only a collapse, it's also an abandonment of our allies. Bennett cannot allow Israel to be the provider of help to a disgraced Biden administration. It is today, 7 months into its administration, it is disgraced. Our national interest cannot be traded for approval and of fleeting approval, temporary approval, and lasting damage. Obviously, our prime minister wants to have a photo op in a rose garden at the White House. If the price of that photo will be agreeing to the prelude of a Palestinian presence in our capital city, Jerusalem, it would be an act of national infamy. A true leader of the Jewish people, of the Jewish nation, will insist on doing that which is in interest of our nation, Israel, maintaining Jerusalem. Not dividing Jerusalem is the only path that the Prime Minister should be pursuing. No balancing act to maintain political power can justify putting our most important national interests at risk, and no government can call itself legitimate if it is willing to subject our nation to such risk. Our Prime Minister is now in the United States, going to the United States on a very sensitive mission, and it's very important that he keep the interests of Israel at heart. Compromise on issues that are really not important is okay. It's expected. Not compromise on our capital, the city of Jerusalem, which we've returned to after 2,000 years. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Thanks again for listening. Jay Shapiro signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.